Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Sorta. This is going to be a bit of a different video. It's going to be an unscripted video, because I'm a little bit behind in my reading schedule. I just, fell a little bit behind reading bigger books, and I saw this week that I had about 6 days to read a book, write a review, and record it. And my oh-so-intelligent mind said, how about you read The Three Musketeers? It's only 700 pages, that won't be a problem. And as you can see, I have not finished reading this book. So what we're going to do instead this week is we're going to discuss some of the series that I have started reading in my life that I absolutely loved at least one book in it. And I'm just never going to finish a series. And we're going to talk about why. We're going to start with Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, The Vampire Chronicles. This book I love. In my opinion, this is a masterwork of gothic vampire fiction. This basically reformed in our mind what vampires should be. This is such a pop cultural icon, and it's actually worthy of its place. Like, the characters are all very fascinating. A lot of them have really in-depth, interesting character lines. The writing is absolutely stunningly beautiful. The storyline is a little bit, meandering, but it's sort of okay because, it's a gothic vampire story. They don't really need to have a very tight plot line. But overall, I love this book. And I've read about 5 or 6 of the Vampire Chronicles, and later on in her life, I think Anne Rice got so powerful and so well respected as an author that editors just stopped telling her, for the love of God, Anne, you need to cut that. So many of the latter Vampire Chronicles are just so overly full with plot cul-de-sacs, random flashbacks that have nothing to do with the story. Let's pause and have an entire character's backstory in the middle of our story. There are entire books that the only actual active part of the story that is continuing through the process of the series is the first 2 pages and the last 3 pages. And everything else in a 700-page book is just a flashback. That was how the last one of the Vampire Chronicles that I read was, Merrick. It's a fun book as long as you are okay with reading an entire book that's just a flashback and there's a random action scene at the beginning and the end that involves Louis being an emotional, dramatic little bitch like he always is. And that's all the action that happens in that book. And also, it's not even just on the overall level. Just scene by scene, there are entire sections that you're and this could have been summarized. Oh my god, why are you giving me the entire history of this one event? I did read The Witching Hour, the first of the Mayfair Witches, and over half of that book is reading the file about the history of Lasher. And that could be interesting for 40 pages, but it's 300 pages! And you're just oh my god, I don't need all this information. And line by line, Anne Rice has purple prose. She writes in a very overfull kind of way. The sentences tend to be long, very descriptive, poetic, lyrical. It feels like reading literature from the 1800s, and that's fun. That works. But there does reach a point that you're okay, but I need a break from this. I need some short, quick, snippy scenes. And the latter books just sort of don't have that. So I do think these were great books, great ideas, but Anne Rice is one of the few authors in the known universe that I will encourage you that if you can get your hands on abridged versions, do. And because of that, I probably never will finish the entirety of the Vampire Chronicles. Also, there are a lot of them. There are 19 of these books, and some of them barely have anything to do with anything, and Armand was my favorite character in the early days, though looking back on it now, that was just because I was a baby teenager and I was an idiot. But he becomes a bit of a monster later on in the series. So, yeah, I will never finish the Vampire Chronicles. The next one has some of the similar reasons why I won't finish it, which is Wizard's First Rule, The Sword of Truth by Terry Goodkind. This book I read in high school, and I loved this book when I first read it. It was the perfect mix of really archetypical, very Tolkien-esque epic fantasy, like playing with a lot of the very common, very like core to the fantasy tropes. And I loved that, and it had enough new stuff mixed in to make it feel fresh. And a lot of the new stuff mixed in are like, you know, archetypical concepts, but they weren't archetypical concepts that are necessarily common to fantasy. And like, also, I'm gonna be upfront here. Part of what I loved about this world was it felt very subversive and unusual and almost dangerous to read. And now that I'm an adult, I know what was actually going on here. Is this book is kinky as hell, and that was interesting. So yeah, I loved the first book. Then I got the second book. I read it between a year that I graduated high school before I went to college, and I read it around my birthday. I was at a summer camp that I absolutely hated being at. I felt completely isolated. I did not like, or I liked the people around me, but I felt like none of them liked me. And so I was just incredibly depressed, reading a book that was incredibly depressing. Like, this is one of those series that, like, everything starts out sort of light and epic fantasy, like, oh, our heroes are all good guys and the world has darkness, but they'll defeat the darkness. And it's all very noble. And then book 2 just gets heavy. The world gets really dark. We start focusing more and more on the depressing things. You get the vibes that no one is going to have a happy ending, and that the few people who do have happy endings are going to be tortured before then. And it is, you know, like 800 pages of that. And I just barely made it through that book. And like, I remember when I finished it going, okay, that was good. I'm never reading another one of these books. And on top of that, I know there are like 21 in this series, most of which are this thick. And I later found out that Terry Goodkind is not a great person. So yeah, never gonna finish Sword of Truth series. I hear that there's a relatively bad TV show that you can watch instead. The third series I'm never gonna finish is the Flor Segunda series by Isabel S. Wills. And like, there's a chance I'll finish this one. So this book, I actually have a review about this one. I absolutely effing loved this book when I read it. It is sort of like early YA, late middle grade kind of reading age range. I really loved the really inventive world that this one exists in. There's something sort of Spanish, sort of like pre-Columbian to the world. I also loved the characters. I specifically loved the fact that Flora is not our traditional fantasy heroine, especially in books for this age. She is overweight. She does not like fashion. She wants to be an adventurer, but she doesn't look down on the girls who do like fashion. And she has a best friend who's a guy who's really into fashion and really into the look stuff. And I loved the dynamic between them, that they were just friends and that they supported each other and had this really, like, sweet friendship that did not feel like it was going to ever be anything more than a friendship. And then I picked up book 2. And, spoiler alert, book 2, those happy, cheerful friends start to have romantic tension. And basically by the end of the book, it's clear that they will end up, by the end of the series, getting together. I don't know if they'll permanently be together, but they're going to have a romantic subplot. And I was just like, why? Like, I was so happy to read them just as friends. Like, we do not need every boy and girl who are close to each other to end up as romantic pairing. And, like, especially considering, like, book 1 and book 2, there's a good bit of diversity in this world. Like, there is polyamorous relationships in this world, and I was like, this is cool. And, like, maybe we'll have this relationship that just doesn't ever develop into anything but friendship, and that's great. And yeah, it is literally that one element that has made me go, I'm not that interested in book 3. And I know it's a stupid thing, but I was just really disappointed with that. And this is one that, like, yeah, if the book fell into my lap, if my sister read it and sent it to me, if I found it in a thrift store, if I, you know, just happened to stumble across it even in a, you know, new bookstore, I probably would buy it, bring it home and read it. But unless the book really throws itself at me, I'm probably not going to read book 3. And it's a stupid thing to care about, but it just hit me in the wrong way. Our fourth series will be the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series. First book is Guilty Pleasures. Now, this is one that I have read, like, I think 6 or 7 in this series. And this is another book I read in high school. And this is one of those books that got passed around my high school, and it was sort of treated as like the taboo, ooh, secretive, like, oh, this is slightly adult material. Because, yeah, like a lot of paranormal fantasies, there's a buttload of sexual tension in this book. And like a huge portion of the plotting in the first, at least the first 6 or 7 books, is a love triangle. And so part of the reason I was so uninterested in reading Twilight when it came out was just because everyone was like, oh my god, this new concept of a love triangle between a vampire and a werewolf and a girl. And I was like, that's the Anita Blake series. Because yeah, huge portions of the early half of this series are just the love triangle between her, a vampire named Jean-Claude, and a werewolf named Richard. And there's a lot about this series that I really love. I really love the world building in it. Like, you'll notice that's one thing I have in common about books. The world building often does attract my attention. And I thought that they did a really good, Anita Blake did a really good job in this series. Laurell K. Hamilton did a really great job in this series of juggling the real world. Because like most paranormals, this is set in a version of our world, but with magic. And specifically, it's a version of our world, but with vampires, werewolves, necromancers, because Anita Blake is a necromancer, and things like that. And like the Fae make an appearance in one book. There are shapeshifters in other books, and I just really loved the level that the tightrope that she walked of people know these things exist, but they're sort of still people who don't believe in them. And like the vampires had recently come out of the coffin and announced themselves to the world that we really exist, but they'd announced themselves to the world as like we're just normal humans with a blood disease. And like they'd gotten granted rights, and there's a lot of difficulty with the fact that Anita Blake is someone who has interacted with them for a while as like a paranormal entity, and she knows them as like the monstrous inhuman things that she deals with on a regular basis. And now they're being like, no, you can't kill us because we're people. And it's got a lot of interesting stuff going on, but the reason I stopped reading it does have to do with the love triangle. Spoilers here. The love triangle does get a resolution, and I just didn't feel like it was the right one. Because like through 3 or 4 books, Anita Blake is clearly in love with Richard, the vampire, the werewolf, and is just sort of sexually attracted to Jean-Claude, the vampire, but does not like him. He has to force her to date him. And a lot of the love triangle is basically him just shoving himself between her and Richard. And then, from one stupid moment, she, spoiler alert, ends up with Jean-Claude. And I know that's not how the rest of the series ends, because reasons. But yeah, it just really struck me as wrong. Because, like, I will admit, Jean-Claude was the one of the two I liked. I liked him better as a character. I found him more interesting. I thought Richard was a little bit milquetoast. But it was clear that Anita liked Richard. So it felt really forced to me to have her suddenly sleeping with Jean-Claude. And also, yeah, simply put, the sudden breaking of the sexual tension just really cut the tension in the book. Now, these books I did for a long time refer to as literary crack. When you pick them up, it's really hard to put them down. And I went to the store to get the next one in the series, never thinking like, oh yeah, I'm not going to read any more of these books. Like, I was fully invested in getting the next one. And the problem is, they're not numbered anywhere on the book. So I was just flipping through them, looking at the back to try to determine which one was the next one I needed to read. And I read a quick segment on one in the back that is like 14 or 15 into the series, and found out that Anita Blake ended up sleeping with a character who was a horrific character as he was presented in the book that he originated in. And I was just like, what? And that one moment had me going, wait, I'm going to buy a different book right now. And I always thought I'd come back to this series, but I never had any desire to come back to the series. So, yeah, it's not that I disliked any of the books. I never got angry at them. I just lost interest in them entirely. And largely it's because of one spoiler that I accidentally read on the back of a book. So, yeah, this series is slightly dead to me. Oops. Next we have the Pern series by Anne McCaffrey. Throughout middle school, junior high, high school, and into college, this was my favorite series of all time. I loved these books. I ate them up like they were candy. Some of the first books I ever reread were Pern books, specifically Dragon Singer and Dragon Song, and those books I reread so many times. I loved this series. And then I got to the point that it looked like one of my favorite characters was going to die. And I just stopped reading. And I don't mean like I stopped reading and paused for a minute at the end of a book. I mean I was 3/4 of the way through a book, put it down, and did not pick it back up for over a decade. Though that's not true. I tried to read it again in college, made it to the exact same point, stopped, could not convince myself to go forward. It was not until about 4 years ago that finally I was like, I'm an adult. I can read past the point when Master Robinson died. And needless to say, I was a bit embarrassed to find out he does not die in that moment. He lives on for another book and a half. So that was ridiculous. But the problem also was when I picked them back up a few years ago and started reading them again, I discovered that a lot of the things that I easily ignored in the 90s are less easily ignored now. Like, the Pern books, in many ways they were progressive for when they were written. Like, the earliest ones were written, I think, in the 70s. Most of them were written in the 80s and early 90s. And so, yeah, it was progressive to have gay male characters. Admittedly, they are all incredibly minor, like, tetrary characters. And admittedly, all the ones that are explicitly gay are heavily leaning on stereotypes. But they're there. There are no lesbians, but they're gay guys. And also just like the gender politics in general in these books, not great. Like, yes, like a lot of fantasy from the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, there were the female characters that are like, I refuse to follow gender norms, I'm gonna do my own thing. And like, at first glance, you're like, yeah, Les is cool, yeah, Millie's cool, yeah, what's the girl who gets the green dragon? Oh god, what was her name? Miram! Miram's cool! And then you go back and reread it, and all the stuff from their point of view, they are really cool, strong female characters. And then you read the bits from the other character's point of view, and you're just like, oh, they're sort of bitchy. Oh. Okay. And like all the male characters are just stereotypical, like, fantasy leads. They are all like, I am noble, I defend people, I'm gonna fight that guy over there for your honor. And I'm just sort of like, okay, like, it's fine. But overall, Pern is a series conceptually that I absolutely love. The basic premise here, these are actually technically sci-fi, not fantasy. They are set on a colony planet so far out in space that, like, there's no way that we're ever going to get out there to see these people. The people to get out there, the first colonists, had to be cryogenically frozen to make it there. And so, like, when they get there and discover there's a problem, there's no help coming. And the problem that they discover when they get there is this planet is being threatened by this weird organism that falls from an asteroid in space. It's like Silver Rain, but it eats through anything organic, including living beings. But luckily, they had enough science left when they arrived here to biogenetically engineer dragons. There were already these critters on planet called fire lizards that are basically miniature dragons. And sorry, I keep reaching over. My cat decides every now and then that he wants to roll into the camera stand. But these fire lizards, they biogenetically engineer giant ones that we can ride, which are dragons. They can fly, they can breathe fire, they can teleport, they are telekinetic, and they bond with one specific human each. And I love this premise. I would kill to have any of these books made into a movie or a TV show. High budget TV show, please let it be high budget. If it's low budget, it will be crap. But I love the notion of this world, the plots of these books. They are great. And if we got a TV version or a movie version, we could update some of the stuff that feels a little bit like dated. It'd be great. But I'm probably never going to finish reading the series. Now, I do know that Anne McCaffrey's books got a lot more... They went with the times. Like, the books of hers that I read that were written in the mid to late 90s, yeah, they feel like they were written in the mid to late 90s. They have a lot more modern gender politics in them. But at the same time, The Pern stuff, the ones that I've left to read, a lot of them are the older ones, or old enough that it's like, okay. And there's also a lot of the few Pern books I have left, a lot of them were written either co-written with her son, Todd McCaffrey, or just fully written by Todd McCaffrey. And no offense to Todd, I just don't like his writing style as much as I liked his mother's. The few that I've tried to read of his, I've only made it a few chapters in and just been like, I don't like this. I don't like any of the characters. I'm not invested. I'm not enjoying this book. So yeah, there are like 5 Pern books left that I will probably never finish. Which the teenager inside of me is very sad about that. And the last series that I'm going to include in this video is Jim Butcher's Harry Dresden series. The Dresden Chronicles is what these are called. I have omnibus editions that I got from the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Book Club, so they look a bit different than most the original books. And I loved these books when I first got them. I have up to, I think, book like 12? And I read them all like they were candy. These are another book that I consider sort of literary crack. Once you start reading them, it's really hard to put them down. It's very pop, kind of fun reading. They are basically fantasy noir. They are basically paranormals, but, you know, paranormals written for boys instead of written for girls. Harry Dresden is very much the classic noir detective character, except imagine him mixed with a neckbeard, because yeah, I have heard modern criticism that Harry Dresden is that obnoxious fantasy sci-fi nerd neckbeard character that we see online, who's like, oh, well, actually, I know all about esoteric stuff, and I'm hot, and you just don't know it, and I can use a sword. And yeah, that is who Harry Dresden is, just the version that they imagine themselves to be. And there is a lot of faint misogyny to the character, but that didn't really bother me because it was writing within that style. And also, to me at least, it was always clear that the books knew that that was bad and wanted us to know that that was not quite good. When Harry Dresden is being misogynistic, it does sometimes come back and bite him in the ass. So yeah, I actually really loved the early books, and they're the kind of books that you don't really want to think too deeply about, but they're fun. And this is one of those series. Nothing ever turned me off of the series. I never reached a point that was just like, I'm done with this. It just gradually lost my interest. The most recent one I got, I only got it because it was in like a 50% off bucket at a bookstore that was going out of business, so I was like, sure, why not? I'll get the next Dresden Chronicles. It's here, I'll read it. And I read it, I enjoyed it, and it wasn't until like a year or two down the line that I realized I had no interest in getting any more of the others. And it took like another year after that for me to finally sort of cement in my mind why I felt that way. And objectively, what it is a lot of these fantasy series that just go on and on and on and on and on, they feel to me a little bit like the anime series that go on and on and on and on. And for that matter, TV series like Supernatural. Like, I always love them in the beginning. They're light and playful and fun. And yes, the characters are fighting existential threats, but there's always that feeling that, like, when this threat is defeated, we'll have a pleasant life. Like, we're aiming at a good life. And as things go on, things just get darker. The character picks up more and more trauma. Everyone around him picks up scars. Everyone around him gets dark backstories. The world starts to feel like, well, it doesn't matter if we defeat this evil. There'll be another one right behind this. And everything just ends up feeling too heavy. And that's what happened with the Dresden Chronicles. The last one I read, it's called, I think it's Ghost Story is the last one I read. And it, spoiler alert, involves Harry being slightly dead. And there was just this feeling by the end of it, just sort of like, sort of wish they'd let him die. At least then he'd find peace. There's just too much going on. He's never going to be happy again. And that's not what I go to fantasy novels for. I want the light, playful silliness. And that's why, objectively, there actually are a lot more series just than these on my shelf that I started. I read a few, I enjoyed them, and I reached a point that I was just like, no more. So yeah, I guess the overall thesis of this video is, my dear fantasy authors, You don't have to constantly raise the stakes. I know a lot of people think that we need perpetual growth. We don't. It is perfectly fine to have a series that they face the same kind of level stakes evil every time. They defeat them, and then they move on with their life. And also, it is perfectly okay to bury your hero and start with a new series. I'm far more likely to pick up that new series than I am to read the 24th novel in what started as a light, playful series and is no longer that. Cool? Cool. And yes, hopefully next week I will be back with a normal book review, presuming I can get through the rest of Three Musketeers by then. Luckily it is a quick read, but it's 700 pages.